So we are recording so that we can post this webinar on our website afterwards for later viewing by folks who weren't able to come tonight. Your attendance is consent for video recording and publishing. If you are using the ASL interpretation, please pin the interpreters by clicking. If you don't know how to pin, let us know and we'll help you out. But you click the 3 little dots on their video and then select pin video. For those of you who may be new to the PTSA, we are a volunteer organization representing the interests of students in Seattle Public Schools who have IEPs, students who have 504 plans, and students who have undiagnosed disabilities. We are an all-volunteer organization. We work to help support families. We work to provide educational opportunities for families to learn about their rights in the special education system. And we advocate on behalf of the disability community in Seattle schools. Again, my name is Janice White. I'm going to be your moderator tonight. And so before we get started, just a couple of meeting agreements that we have at our meetings. Please keep your sound on mute unless you're asking a question. We have closed captioning on, and as I mentioned before, we have ASL interpretation. So if you do speak, please state your name first and try to speak slowly. It helps both with the closed captioning and also for the ASL interpretation. If you'd like, please sign into the chat with your name and the school that your child or children attend. It helps us know where in the city and which schools our information is getting out to, and it helps us with our outreach as a district-wide PTSA to know where folks are coming from. If you have questions as Mary goes through her presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat. I am going to try to keep track of those and help Mary when it's time for questions at the end of her presentation. So with that, I want to tell you a little bit about our guest speaker tonight, Mary Griffin. Mary is an attorney who is of counsel at Johnson George LLP. She also provides pro bono legal advocacy in her solo practice. Mary represents families who have disputes with school districts and is well acquainted with the issues associated with the pandemic, including compensatory and recovery services. This year, Mary has filed and won several special education citizen complaints against Seattle Public Schools for systemic violations of IDEA. That's the federal law governing special education. Mary was also president of this PTSA in 2013 and 2014. She also participated in Seattle Public Schools Superintendent's Special Education Advisory and Advocacy Council, which is called SEAC, as well as the Seattle Special Education Task Force. As a parent, Mary wrote the white paper for SEAC on discipline and disproportionality. Also as a parent, she spearheaded the passage of House Bill 1688 in 2013, which required parental notification of the use of restraint and seclusion. She has testified at the school board level, as well as at OSPI and in front of the Washington legislature on the use of restraint and seclusion, as well as school discipline, mental health, and various other special education issues. I'm going to put in the chat a couple of links where you can find out more about Mary, but without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Mary now. Thanks. Mary, you're muted.
That's not a good way to start. So I'm here to talk about recovery services, and Janice already covered who I am and how I got into this situation. I am the mother of a former Seattle Public Schools students with multiple disabilities, and before I was a lawyer, I was a nurse practitioner. So I am a 2017 graduate of Seattle University School of Law. So what are recovery services? This is the definition that is used by OSPI, or the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, to describe the special education and related services and supports provided to students with disabilities to address the ongoing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the spring 2020 school facility closures. So throughout this slideshow, you'll see little footnotes and the links are up at the top. So that definition comes from the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction's Roadmap for Special Education Recovery Services 2021 and beyond. That document is frequently updated and there are FAQs that go with it. So as with everything else with COVID, things are in flux. You will also hear recovery services when talking about general education students. So that is a confusing item, especially, we'll talk about that later. Anyways, when I talk about recovery services, I'm talking about special education. Recovery services are designed to address the lack of appropriate progress on IEP goals due to missed or limited special education related services, or for other reasons as a result of the pandemic. So one thing that you should keep in mind is that recovery services is defined by OSPI in guidelines. It is not found in state or federal law. Recovery services should be considered for every student with an IEP by the IEP team. Recovery services are different than compensatory services. Recovery services, like I said, are decided by the IEP team. Compensatory services historically are awarded through dispute resolution process, typically through either a citizen complaint or through a due process complaint. However, compensatory services have been awarded in the past when school districts have agreed that they have not provided the services that were called for in an IEP, and then sometimes they will do that on their own. Here are some other differences between recovery services and compensatory services. This is from a very nerdy legal document by Perry Zirkle on the difference between compensatory, he calls it the difference between compensatory services and compensatory education. But we're going to stick with what OSPI uses. So recovery services are pandemic specific. They only apply during this time frame, whereas compensatory services are generally available at any time. Recovery services looks only at progress, otherwise known as regression recoupment, whereas compensatory services is awarded when there is an inability or failure to provide a free, appropriate public education. So one of the things that school districts may object to in terms of compensatory services is that there is some sort of blame associated with compensatory services, historically at least. So they don't like to talk about compensatory services for that sort of a reason. If it was not possible to provide the sort of education that the student needed, they are still on the hook for it for lack of progress, but they don't want people saying that they are somehow to blame for it. Recovery services the approach is to close the gap, whereas with compensatory service, the approach is, or the goal is to elevate the student to the position they would have occupied absent the school district's failures. Recovery services, the main approach to the main approach to the lack of progress during the pandemic. Compensatory services are still available. but OSPI / an administrative law judge, ALJ, may look at whether progress has been made to decrease the amount of hours available to the student. In other words, if the district did not provide a service, but the student still made progress, I have seen OSPI cut the number of hours available to the student for compensatory service because the student made progress, despite the fact that the district did not provide services. This can happen, for example, if a parent sat by a student's side and worked with the student to make progress. It can happen if they hired a tutor. It can happen for a lot of reasons. A student can still make progress without the district having provided any service. And obviously, as a parent, you can see the problem with recovery services there. The source, like I said before, the source for recovery services comes from OSPI guidelines. Every state across the country has something similar set up because the US Department of Education decided in March of 2020 that each state was going to have to set up a system to award compensatory education to students. So each state has a different system. Our state's system is this recovery services with its guidelines. For compensatory services, the source is case law under the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So this is a chart that was provided by OSPI for priorities for recovery services. And I would say that this is pretty aspirational in design. It talks about equity and opportunity, urgency and triage, and transparency and engagement. And it starts out with equity and opportunity, and it talks about equity and inclusion, making data-informed decisions, which is always a good idea, and IDEA and free appropriate public education requirements, which should always be at play with a student with an IEP. In terms of who gets the recovery services first, they want the districts to prioritize by need. In other words, a student who made no progress or regressed over the school closures and as a result of the hybrid or lack of in-person education, you should prioritize by need. Progress should be monitored and regression should be noted. They say that the districts should start now. They provide the services and then reevaluate as they go along. In other words, it is a legitimate approach for a school district to decide, okay, well, let's start with 40 hours of recovery services and then reevaluate. That is a legitimate approach. And then moving on to transparency and engagement. Students and families are partners, communicate early and often, and always consider language access needs, of course. More on recovery services. This is straight from OSPI. Families should not have to ask for IEP teams to consider recovery services. You should not have to send 5 emails to the district to ask them to consider recovery services. OSPI has made it clear that this year, their guidelines call for school districts to consider recovery services at the annual IEP meeting or sooner if needed. So that should be considered at a meeting. What I have seen often is that the districts are delaying this and that families are having to ask many times for the district to consider recovery services. The next one is generally the recovery services are not provided in the same amount that was missed. So that is true for both recovery services and compensatory services. So the if, for example, you know that your student missed 100 hours of special education services and you sit down in the IEP team, it would not be unusual for the IEP team to come up with a number of, 1/4 to 1/2, typically around 1/3 of the hours missed, to be provided as recovery services, depending on what sort of services it was. If the service started out as a one-to-one service, in other words, speech language therapy, your student didn't receive any speech language therapy over a certain amount of time, I think that would be in the realm of compensatory services, but it would also likely be somewhere closer to the original number of hours missed, because it's a one-to-one service. In other words, it's an intense service to start out with, and the recovery services should be equally as intense. So it's not an easy thing to figure out. Recovery services should generally be provided during the school, not be provided during the school day. It can impact the child's least restrictive environment if this child is pulled out of general education to receive special education services. It can impact a lot of things. So it's generally advised not to provide recovery services during the school day. OSPI has not forbidden the school districts from doing that, but you should think twice before you agree to that, because it can impact other things that are going on. Recovery services can be remote or in person or hybrid, and you should try to communicate with the district as how those services will be supplied. If your student had a lot of difficulty accessing remote services during COVID, it would probably be a mistake to have the recovery services delivered remotely too. However, these are things you may not have a lot of control over in the future. We all hope that everything can return back the way it was, or if your student does better with remote, you might be able to ask for that, but it's a difficult issue right now, because there are difficulties with providing both remote and in-person services at the same time. Recovery services can be provided before or after school, as well as over breaks. You should be careful about arranging services during breaks when it doesn't seem likely that school district staff will be available. That is a difficulty. If your recovery services include tutoring from a private tutor, then it's quite possible that you could do that on the weekend, or you can arrange that with a private tutor if that's included as part of the recovery services. Recovery services can include in-person structured play groups or peer social groups before or after school or during breaks. That is a really good way to get social emotional services lined up. That's just a really good way to deliver them. It can also include compensatory education as part of the recovery services package. I'm not sure that at that point that there's a whole lot of difference between the two. So how to determine the recovery services? So this is a really good chart from OSPI that you can look at. I think you should also be provided with this PowerPoint from, or you can receive a copy of this PowerPoint, but it's generally a good way of thinking about how to decide or how to arrive at how many hours your student needs. And this is something the staff should have or should be at least be aware of, but I've been in several meetings where it doesn't seem like they've reviewed this. So the way that they think about this is your present level. You want to think about what were the present levels before COVID. You want to look at the progress rate. What does his normal progress, how much progress does the student usually make? You can look at the goals that were developed for your student to see where the IEP team thought the student should have been in a year. And then you can also look at services. What special education and related services were documented in the student's pre-COVID IEP? So that is, that would look like the service matrix. They have this section here. What concerns have been raised by the parents? What is the difference between the student's current present levels of performance? So this is looking at how to determine what kind of progress was made. To what extent has the student's level of progress on IEP goals decreased or slowed compared to baseline levels? And what special education related services were offered to the student in spring 2020 and during the 2020 to 21 school year compared to the baseline offer of FAPE? I don't know that that particular issue is very important to anybody. As far as I can tell, OSPI seemed mainly concerned as to whether the school district documented progress during the closure of the buildings in spring 2020 and didn't seem to be very concerned with what actual services were provided. It doesn't seem to me that most of the students were provided anything anywhere near FAPE, and all the citizen complaints that were filed over that summer, this OSPI made it clear that they were basically concerned with whether or not progress had been documented. To what degree did the student access the offered services in spring 2020 and during the 2021 school year? This is a very, very important question because some students were able to access services fairly well, other students were not. It really helps your argument as to whether your student was able to access the services if you have documentation of that, either in emails to the district or actually back from the district. Sometimes I will see that level of access documented in there. If your student wasn't able to access anything during the pandemic, or during the 2021 school year, then the student likely made not much progress and probably needs a lot of recovery services. So then they make the recovery services decision. How and when will the students access the recovery services? What options are available for inclusive access? Whether recovery services are provided during or outside of the school day. Based on the student's current rate of progress, age, and developmental level, what is the timeline for the student to achieve the expected level progress for the identified recovery services? How and how often will parents be informed of progress on recovery services? And based on the student's present level of performance and missed or reduced services during the pandemic, what special education or related service areas or IEP goals require recovery services? In other words, they may look at different goals and say they made progress on some and not on others, and may decide they only need some sorts of the services. So preparing for that meeting is very important, and it takes quite a lot of time and patience. You're going to need your student's most recent pre-COVID IEP. So you're going to have to go dig through your documents or your emails and find an IEP dated from March 21st, 2019 through March 20th of 2020. You can also find your current IEP. You can compare them to see how they may have changed the goals or not changed the goals. A lot of this is indicative of whether the IEP team felt that the student made progress. You're going to find the progress report for June 2021, which should have some of the other dates on there. It may or may not have them. You may need other progress reports over the last 2 years. And you're going to need a lot of patience. You're going to compare each goal from the prior IEP with the progress made on the June 2021 progress report. You're going to, this is in an ideal world. This is how OSPI envisioned that this process would happen. So I'm going to cover in my next slide, I'll cover situations where this will not work. Note the areas where the student did not make sufficient progress or may have regressed. So regression refers to losing skills that your student already may have attained. You can see that where it may say that your student made progress prior to the closure and then lost, went down in score. So he may have had a 3 on his progress report or her progress report, and then it may go back to a 2 or a 1 in that area. And so like for this goal, this is my son's goal back in 2014. So I just used this because I didn't want to use anybody else's. I thought I'd use my son's. So if this is during the pandemic and he experienced regression, let's say they said in 2014, and well, let's say prior to a pandemic, he could write a paragraph of 6 sentences that include a topic sentence and its supporting details. Let's say he could do that 3 out of 5 times, and then by a year later he could only do that once or not at all. That would be regression. Look at the IEP service matrix for both specially designed instruction and related services to determine if instruction and services were missed. So if you look at the service matrix, you can see, for example, if we look at this one, he had 30 minutes 6 times monthly of speech language services. So let's say he didn't receive any speech language services and he stopped being able to answer questions about paragraphs such as who was the main character, what was going on. And so he lost that ability. That would mean that he missed all of this time and probably needs compensatory services, or that he needs the IEP team to consider compensatory services if he didn't receive any of a particular service. Okay, what else? Okay, generally OSPI, so here it is again, will not fault a district for not providing instruction/services during spring 2020 building closures. They would if the district agreed to provide them in the CLP and the parent filed a complaint. I have seen some of that happen, but generally not. Generally, the districts became accountable for a free appropriate public education starting with the beginning of the 2020-2021 school year. So as an attorney, I don't spend a lot of time looking at March of 2020 to the end of June 2020 as far as what services were provided, because I have not seen anyone be successful with that argument. Concerns. So here's where I'm talking about, well, Mary, it's been more than a year since the pandemic started. And if I look at the IEP that was developed before COVID, it's 2 years old. The goals should have been updated, but I have seen sometimes recently where they have not been updated. And that creates a problem for the IEP team. If the goals have not been updated, basically the IEP team is looking at goals that are 2 years old. In other words, student should not have had 2 years to make a goal that was originally developed as a 1-year goal. This would indicate if you have goals that are 2 years old, this indicates that the student did not make progress during the pandemic. So if you see that they reused the goals or the goals have not been updated for 2 years, that should raise a red flag. The next thing that I see a lot of, student was not available for data collection, or the district may have been unwilling, unable to collect data. That happens a lot. And I would say that that's a violation. At this point, it's September. The kids are generally supposed to be back in school, and the district should have had some record of progress reporting done. Next one is goals may not have been appropriate for a remote setting. So in other words, they didn't work on them. If they had goals that said student will greet another student upon entering the classroom, they didn't work on that, you're just going to have to look at other goals. I don't know how to get around the issue of goals that were not appropriate for the remote setting. Goals may have, the next one is goals may have changed during the last 2 years. That should have occurred. If your student made progress and made adequate progress, the goals should have been changed. And I mean, not just twiddled. So when I say twiddled, I'm talking about, for example, if you have a student who has a goal of writing out words spelled correctly, you know, the goal from prior to the pandemic was the student will write out 60 out of 100 words correctly on, you know, 2 out of 3 trials. And then they changed that. The student didn't make that goal. The student only wrote out 4 words, and they changed the goal to something lower, or they changed something higher, but the baseline is very low. So in other words, the baseline for may have been, you know, 0, and the student could now write out, after 2 years, can now write out 4 words spelled correctly. So you need to be careful about that. If they met their goal and they made progress, that's great. That indicates that your student made progress. But you're going to have to look at them to see if they tweaked them just a little bit to make it look like the student made progress. Next thing that I see a lot is progress reports just missing data completely, missing reporting times, or missing progress. So you're going to have to ask the school district to supply that data if it's missing. If you look at your June progress report and there's no data, then you need to get the data put in there. Progress reports may be very vague or not measured in the same terms. This is much more common. I see this much more common since the kids were in remote. It may be because they could not get the same situation set up. A lot of times parents are assisting. A lot of times they seem to have just completely switched what the goal says around. That is not appropriate. It doesn't help the parent to determine, it doesn't help anybody to determine if the student made progress if the comments say seem to have changed the goal. In other words, if the student was supposed to independently put their coat on before going outside, and they say parent reports student can put his socks on with help, that doesn't help. So what you need to make sure is that the terms on the progress notes are the same. And then the question is, what about general education concerns? When a lot of students with special education needs return to school, some of them were in very small segregated environments, often by themselves. If they had no exposure to general education as their IEPs may have required, they were not getting their least restrictive environment needs met. And so this is a concern that isn't reflected in IEPs or in OSPI's recovery services model. So I've not been able to solve that problem. It will show up for kids who have social emotional or behavioral goals that were not met, but otherwise I have not been able to solve that problem. I think it's a FAPE violation, but I have not had a lot of success with OSPI on that one. What is the effect if student made progress because the parent hired a tutor or quit her job to assist and tutor the student at home? So the student made progress, so is not under OSPI's guidance, they are not eligible for recovery services. So I have not found a way around that one either. And then what is the effect if the district blames the parent for the lack of student progress because the parent was working or unavailable during the school day? So I have seen this a lot scattered throughout students' IEPs and progress notes, parent blaming the parents. You should ask to have that reframed without putting blame on parents for parents who have to work. And the effect on that is that the student didn't make progress, and that is not the parent's fault. So I've seen more of that this year than I've ever seen, districts blaming parents for lack of progress, and it's deplorable. I can understand their frustration, and it certainly is a very frustrating thing for everybody, but it doesn't deserve blame. Okay, recovery transition services. I'm going to talk about the transition services for students in ages 16 to 21 who have not graduated from high school. So students of transition age, usually ages 16 to 21, may have experienced disruptions to work-based learning and community access during this time. In fact, almost all of them have. Students who turned age 21 during the 2019 to 2020 or 220, I can't say this, 2020 to 21 have not yet earned a diploma may also need transition recovery services. So the legislature has given OSPI, and OSPI can distribute funds for students over the age of 21 who did not receive their transition services, as long as they have not graduated. In other words, if they don't have a diploma, they can have a certificate of attendance, but not a diploma. Districts should supply those services. Discussions should address the lack of reasonable progress on the IEP goals or the IEP transition plan, as well as missed or limited special education or related services. They should also discuss support students to achieve expected levels of progress towards their post-secondary goals as indicated in their IEP transition plan and high school and beyond plan. Examples of transition recovery services include all these items. Support, this is straight from OSPI. Support to apply for eligibility with adult agencies, including Division of Vocational Rehabilitation and the Developmental Disabilities Administration. Fulfill job shadowing as indicated on the IEP transition plan. Can provide additional in-person structured community or employment experiences, support to access and prepare for the ACT, SAT, or other college entrance exams, and specially designed instruction or related services to support drafting and revising a resume, completing applications for jobs and further education, setting and maintaining a weekly budget, using functional communication strategies in community settings, and independently using the public transportation system. So these are examples straight from OSPI. The documentation should be written in the prior written notice, similar to the documentation for compensatory education. So in other words, not in the IEP. Transition recovery services and what a school day means may look different for students receiving transition services, especially past age 21. Students over the age of 21 are no longer eligible for a free and appropriate public education through an IEP. For students who have not yet earned a diploma, the IEP team may determine that transition recovery services are still needed. Rather than an IEP with progress reports, these transition recovery services and timelines will be documented through a prior written notice. So that's confusing. But as you can see, they're saying that students over the age of 21 do not get a FAPE. At the IEP meeting, you should be prepared, have your notes, have the old IEP, the June 2021 progress report at a minimum. You should discuss whether you think your student has regressed or did not make progress. Being prepared to have that discussion will back you up, and it is likely you will be more prepared than anybody else in the room. Be realistic about your student's stamina for long school days and vacation days. In other words, don't decide that your student is going to go to school all during winter break when everybody else is not going to school. That may not work for some kids, and I would anticipate that the district would have a lot of problems hiring staff for that. So that's just a word of caution. Plan the services and transportation if needed. Discuss the time frame for delivery. You can extend it to the summer of 2023 if necessary. That is clear from the guidelines. The decisions should be recorded in the prior written notice. So somebody sent in some things that they noticed. One person noticed that she received something that said the IEP team needs to collect data, and then an IEP team meeting needs to be held so that all team members can review the student data / progress on IEP goals. The IEP team will then determine if recovery services are needed and the potential impact this may have on a student day. So there are at least two things wrong with this. The IEP team should not have to collect additional data if there is already a June 2021 progress report. The IEP team, if the student returned to school in June and there was a progress report issued, it should have all of the data that the team needs to decide whether or not the student is making good progress. I can see that if you had an IEP team meeting in May and you had new goals developed in May, and so in June when they reported on those goals, the student hadn't made any progress, you would just look at the progress from March or look prior to that particular time frame. I have to think that this person was responding mechanically or was copying, pasting something from last fall. I don't really know why anyone would say they need to collect more data to decide on recovery services. It's clear from OSPI guidelines that they don't need to collect extra data. And the other thing that's wrong here is there should not be an impact on the student's day. Recovery services normally aren't considered for the student's day. So I'm not really sure why this staff member wrote this back, but so this got a fish because it's a fishy answer. And you should be suspicious of similar fishy answers. What if you don't agree with the IEP team? Dispute resolution options are still available per OSPI. This includes IEP facilitation, mediation through sound options, citizen complaint, and due process. So I don't think IEP facilitation should be listed here because it's not an IEP. It's not an IEP you're talking about, it's recovery services. So you could do mediation or citizen complaint or due process. So far, I am unsure of how an administrative law judge in a due process proceeding would review a complaint about recovery services, as recovery services are not available under IDEA. And I have not seen an administrative law judge make a ruling on OSPI guidance. That would be very unusual. They make rulings on law, and the guidance doesn't count as law. So that's a really dicey thing. What I have seen lawyers do is just file for due process and ask for compensatory services for missed time or missed services. And that's probably the way, if you tried to file a due process, that's probably how you would do it. So far, OSPI is mostly concerned with, did the district follow the procedures to consider the need for recovery services? In other words, there have been some citizen complaints about recovery services, and the OSPI has not looked at whether the district decided on an adequate number or an adequate type. So they're just looking at whether the district followed the procedures, and I'm not even sure what the procedures are that OSPI thinks the IEP team needs to consider. So I anticipate that the OSPI will be seeing more citizen complaints, and I'm looking forward to reading them to see how they're ruling on those issues. Also, like I've said several times, if the student made progress on the IEP goals, OSPI is more likely to find that there was, quote, no material impact, unquote, and will not find that there is a violation, even if the district did not provide services. And I have no information at this time as to how OSPI might respond to other concerns about recovery services in a citizen complaint. So here are some potential points for advocacy, and this is my lovely picture of a brainstorm. And I'm depending on organizations like the Seattle Special Education PTSA to advocate. And I think all of the students in here, all of the students in special education are hoping that you will advocate. Seattle Public Schools is slated to receive $92 million in recovery funds for all students. So recovery funds as used in this are from the American Recovery Plan, ARP, and they're called ESSER 3, ESSER 3, 1, 2, so it's got Latin 3 after it. You can advocate to your school board members how that should be spent. Some suggestions include provision of recovery services, professional development and universal design, inclusionary practices, and mental health supports for all students. I've seen recently that Seattle is saying now that they are going to have a point of contact in all buildings for students who may have mental health concerns, but I think they can do more than that. Above all, Seattle Public Schools must plan for recovery services as soon as possible. So here's my all caps statement here. They must provide infrastructure and funding to make it happen. So here's some questions. Do they need a recovery services czar? Do they need to start planning right now? Should they be talking to the union now? Should they plan to provide incentives to staff? Should they start working on transportation at some point? Should they take input on how they might improve delivery of services over the summer? Yes. So those are my points that I think you as parents can work on and put in front of the school board as to what your priorities are, that you can all work amongst yourselves and
Mary, you're muted all of a sudden.
okay. So anyway, so I think that this is the most important thing you as a parent can do for all of the students right now, is to advocate for Seattle Public Schools to reform itself as far as providing the level of services that are going to be required for these recovery services. We don't want the kids to be a year behind for the rest of their life and not be able to get a job, not to get adequate housing, not to be able to support themselves or go to future schools because they missed out on a year of special education services. So that is my point. So now I'm going to look at the questions, or else someone is going to tell me the questions.
So
And I'm
I
going to
can help.
stop screen sharing. I'm going to stop screen sharing. Here we go.
So this is Janice.
Okay.
And I can help. I'm going to, Liz Adderhold, I may have pronounced your last name wrong, but you had a couple of questions in the chat. And then after Liz, a few people sent me questions that I will follow up with after Liz. So Liz, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your questions?
Sure. So I guess I'm mainly hoping to find out, like, actually my case manager was on top of things and already said that we're eligible for recovery services. So I'm wondering what they can actually look like if teachers aren't usually available for breaks, and I don't want to add more time onto a kindergartner's day. So I don't know if anyone has insight who did participate in recovery services from this past summer, or if you have insight, Mary, like.
Sure.
What is it?
So I think many people experienced a train wreck this summer. Although some people did get adequate recovery services, it seemed like however they experienced it, overall, it was poorly planned. So that needs to improve. Overall, there was not enough staffing, even for summer hours. That was a huge problem. So over the summer, there was ESY going on. There were students who were receiving compensatory services. There were students receiving recovery services. There were students in the summer staircase program, and there was probably other things going on. But overall, it was very, very poorly organized. I thought I was going to have a nice summer vacation, but I have a stack of complaints from parents about the summer services. It can't happen that way again. And although I would say summer is probably the best time to try and get these services delivered. The other thing you can consider are tutoring, camps, private services of some sort. Those are things that the team can consider. Overall, IEP teams are not well set up to consider things like private tutoring or camps or anything in the community that may be available. And when you go to your meeting, if you can think ahead of time of what you think might meet your students' needs, you can suggest it. And you might want to make sure that there is somebody there, like a supervisor, who can say, yeah, we'll pay for, a week of camp at a certain place where your student will get their social emotional hours in, or not. But usually the teacher themselves are not gonna okay that. But so that should be on the table. I think that many students will end up going to summer school to get their recovery services. And overall, I think the school district could do a lot better job organizing that. So that's all I'm going to say.
So a follow-up, this is Janice, and a follow-up on that, Mary, a question that was sent to me was, could students who went to summer school this past summer get extra services because the summer program was cut short?
If they missed out on that week of recovery services that was supposed to be supplied, that should be supplied again next summer. That for sure should happen. But I don't think that there's any infrastructure currently present where anyone is going around and saying, oh, all these students missed a week of recovery services, and so we need to figure out a way to make up those services next summer. That should be happening, but it's not. I mean, there should be, in my book, someone, as I called it, a recovery services czar, who's tracking all of this.
So another question that was sent to me was, what if recovery services are in the IEP? Is it then, something that would be under IDEA if it came in front of an administrative law judge?
Wow. Well, that would be a great case. I don't know. I don't know how anyone would decide on that. But you're right, that this is why my understanding is recovery services shouldn't be listed in the IEP. On the other hand, they're having the IEP team to make these decisions. It doesn't make a lot of legal sense. I have a lot of concerns about recovery services, and I think if you look on like the Washington Autism Alliance and Advocacy has a piece, I think that was written by Kathy George with all her concerns about recovery services. And I think that's a good one. What if I can't give you an answer.
This is Yana. Mary, could you tell us if when students miss school in the summer or the summer school or recovery services in the summer, could they receive it over different break or during the day if the parents agreed to it? Or do they really have to wait until next summer?
Well, they definitely could if you can get staff to do that. I just think it's unlikely. I think based on what has transpired over the last 5 years from what I've seen, it's very difficult for teachers to want to come in and work on their weekends. And I think the union may have problems with it too. I'm not really sure. I wouldn't bet on anything happening on a weekend. Let's just say that much.
Well, this is Yana. So would they be able to get it if another provider was to provide it? Let's say it doesn't have to be the student's current teacher, right?
Right. Yeah, you can get that. If you can get the district to arrange that can happen.
Thank you.
Erica, I believe, had a question in the chat. Erica, if you want to unmute.
Hello, this is Erica. So my son suffered regression during COVID school shutdown. They denied me recovery services because they said his eyesight was bad. His eye doctor disagrees. Do I just keep complaining?
So I hear so many things. It's just amazing, but that's not going to work. That doesn't work. You can file a citizen complaint over that. You can hire an attorney. You can write a letter and threaten to file a citizen complaint. You have a lot of options available. I would definitely keep complaining and you could try going up the chain of command. But if he regressed, he regressed. And if he has eye problems, then maybe that's something they need to address too. That sounds like an access problem or a disability problem or something that is their responsibility. So I don't know. That's just ridiculous. Sorry.
This is Janice again. I may be mispronouncing your name, Sanjita. You can unmute yourself if you like, because you had a couple of questions in the chat.
Hi, I'm sorry, I'm Ioana. I just wanted to ask a question about the ESSER 3 funds. So my son regressed, he has dyscalculia, and I was wondering if I can request these services as tutoring, as a tutoring program and be added to the IEP.
So you can definitely, when you have your meeting, you can ask for private tutoring. You can also ask for one-to-one tutoring from school staff. It's up to the IEP team as to the decision as to whether or not they think that's a good idea. And like I said, anytime that you want to consider private services, you should have the supervisor for the region there. They're not regional supervisors anymore, are they? I don't know how you should have the supervisor there, whoever it is.
The special education supervisors are coordinated with the supervisors of the principals. And you're right, Mary, it's not regional anymore, but there's a list on the website.
Yes. So if you don't know who your supervisor is, you can ask your IEP team to make sure that the supervisor is in attendance and let them know you're planning to ask for private tutoring or whatever kind of tutoring it is that you're asking for, one-to-one tutoring.
So
This is
this
Yana. I have another question that came to me right now is how could parents show that there is a need for recovery services when the student's progress report shows that they are making progress, but they're not? And then can they use private provider evaluations to show the present levels?
So that's going to be a really tough one. And it is unlikely, in my estimation, that an IEP team is going to agree with you that the student did not make progress based on your private evaluation. That this is a problem. I mean, I've seen this myself where for whatever reason, an IEP team has written that the student made progress when the student did not make progress. And it's going to be, that would be a very, very difficult issue. You would be in dispute and you would have to do your dispute resolution. And even so, like I said, I would be very cautious as to going into an expensive dispute resolution process if you don't see that either OSPI in its citizen complaint decisions or an administrative law judge in the due process decisions has made a similar decision in a parent's favor before entering into that sort of dispute resolution process. It's going to be difficult. Let's just say that much. I don't have a good answer for you, Yana.
So this is Janice. So this is from a teacher in Seattle Public Schools who says that she says, we don't know who will be providing recovery services or how they will be trained or supervised, who will be responsible for data collection, how will progress be documented. My families are asking, and I have nothing to tell them.
So here is a great opportunity for advocacy that this PTSA can add on its list. Those things should be available to teachers. Teachers and IEP team need to know that they're not going to be obligated to provide the services over the summers themselves when they make these decisions. And parents need to know in advance, who will be providing these services that I'm agreeing to. So I have seen in other districts that they have people who coordinate these things and a menu of options for teachers to choose from with, already decided, locations and already decided sorts of suppliers. So that is something that I think the PTSA should advocate for. And when they advocate, like I said, they, getting information from the teacher's point of view, the union's point of view, et cetera, and coming to the school board will be so much more useful than just coming at it from our own little corner of the world perspective. So that's really great. I love that. It's very practical. Teachers need to know these things. Parents need to know these things. I think this is a great information. I'm glad that the teacher provided that. That they don't know. They don't know either.
This is Donna. There's another question from Lisa. So if an IEP team determines a student is eligible for after-school recovery services and there is no one available to provide them, can parents ask the district to pay for private programs and tutors?
Okay, so normally district is required to provide a FAPE. And when the district doesn't provide the FAPE and the parents end up having to provide it, they can ask for reimbursement. That's pretty standard. So here you have a situation for recovery services, which are not FAPE. And the usual issues with that problem are the same. I think it would be reasonable for the school district to reimburse the parent, but I can't guarantee at all that they would. So I might be hesitant about doing that without getting the supervisor or somebody at the school district to okay that before you pay money out. They're still on the hook for the recovery services, even though they didn't provide them. So they should still be on the hook for it. So if you want to make a separate arrangement with them and you're successful with it, good for you. But I wouldn't lay out money unless I had that I had an agreement that was written beforehand.
This is Janice. Another question that came to me. Can you clarify where the recovery services should be recorded, since you said it should not be in the student's IEP, or did I misunderstand?
I think it can be, so the recovery services, I think, should be recorded, the offer should be recorded in the prior written notice. I believe the progress can be written on regular progress reporting. That's my understanding of it. I can get clarification on that issue for you if somebody wants to send me. I'll send it to Janice, but that's my understanding at this point, is that it should be written in the prior written notice, and progress I've seen it already where progress is reported on the progress reports, the regular ones.
This is Yana. So I have another one. What is the best way to go about dispute resolution? So I know, but can you help us understand, or the families understand, in what case roughly, I know this is more complicated than that, you would go which route?
If
resolution.
It really depends, Yana.
Well,
I'm giving you my legal answer here. It depends.
Oh, I know, but somebody's asking me to ask you, so.
Now, at this point, I think it's best to go to the citizen complaint route. If you don't need an expert witness, if you need an expert witness, you're not going to get anywhere with a citizen complaint. Okay, that's a general answer, and that's not legal advice.
Rita, you put a question in the chat. Do you want me to read it, or do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I can unmute. So it was my understanding that recovery services, we had the option of doing summer or doing it this fall. And so I opted for this fall due to just the mental strain of my kid, that I thought it was in his best interest to wait until fall. And now I don't think we have any. I have a great IEP team, but I don't know how to go beyond that. I don't have private tutors set up. I don't have any of that, but he definitely has regressed in some of his goals. And so how do I even get started on that?
So has the IEP team recognized that he has regressed?
I believe so, yes.
So normally if he's regressed on all of his goals.
Not all of them,
Okay,
I don't think.
so you would look at the goals where he's regressed.
Okay.
And you would look at documentation of whether he was even able to access anything. First, you would look at that. Was he able to access?
No, I actually ended up not working last year and body doubling him, so that he could get work done. And then it became such a mental health issue that I had to stop. And so he wasn't able to access a lot of things.
Right. So for things where he wasn't able to access, generally that would be like compensatory services. So more of a time thing. And then, like I said, it's not a straight one-to-one kind of an issue. It's more of a, like I said, somewhere probably around a third of the time, depending on what kind of services it was. And IEP teams are not used to awarding compensatory services. They've never done it before, but under OSPI's new guidance, they can do this. So some of them are just really, they're lost. They haven't gotten guidance. Seattle Public Schools has not provided good guidance to the teachers on how
No,
to
they
make these
haven't.
kinds of decisions. I don't think many teachers even know that there's a pot of money that this can come out of. They may be overly frugal. So you should come there prepared to talk about how much time he missed in each area where he didn't make progress or he regressed. You
Okay.
should come prepared to talk about the levels that he, you know, where he's functioning well and where he's not, what kind of services you think he needs. If you think he needs private tutoring, then you should say that, or one-to-one. Seattle has said that they can provide one-to-one tutoring. You know, come there prepared to say these things. And, you know, if you have to practice saying, I think my son needs 200 hours of compensatory services in social emotional services, as well as the mental health issue, I think that's a separate issue that should be addressed right now, without even trying to deal with recovery services. They are saying, they have said they've had a half an hour King 5 special on all the mental health supports they're going to be providing this year. So I would ask for that
Okay.
right off the bat. Get some mental health support for your son so that he can make progress in school right now. And then also, you know, plan to come to that meeting for recovery services so that you're the most prepared person in the room.
Okay. Most of the mental health stuff was the fact that he could not engage with the curriculum online due to his disability, dyslexia, dyscalculia, all of those kind of things. So
yeah, so you're saying he might be doing well in person.
Yes, I think he's doing better, but he still has regressed, you know, in most of his goals. So
yeah, so go to the meeting prepared to say those things, and if you have to practice saying those, you can. And if you come up with an outlandish, you can come there and say, I think he missed, you know, 1,000 hours of instruction or whatever it is that you think he missed. So if you think of school as 180 days and the, you know, for a school year and it's 6 hours long, roughly, you know, that's something like 1,000, it's over 1,000 hours.
Yeah, because the recovery services doesn't just include the IEP goals, it also includes general education.
Well, that's unclear.
Okay.
That is very unclear. It just talks about special education and progress on special education goals in most places. Although in one point in OSPI's guidance, it does talk about general education. Most IEP teams are not willing to discuss general education, but if it's included as access, in other words, if your student has a one-to-one to access general education, didn't get any general education, didn't get any one-to-one, I would certainly discuss it there, okay? That's one of the big problems that I discovered is some supervisors told the teachers that they didn't have to include any services that were delivered in general education, and that's wrong. So I want to be clear about that. If the special education services are being delivered in the general education classroom, all that time needs to be counted. Okay.
Okay, so that's basically resource room kids.
So access kids in particular really lost out. Okay. They had a terrible time during the pandemic, but resource room kids too lost a lot. And they should be eligible for the services that are being supplied to general education services, general education students, which Seattle Public Schools has said they're going to supply. I don't know what they're counting for that. It might be like the summer staircase program. I'm not really sure. So.
Thank you.
This is Yana. I have a question just to piggyback on this. Because it's based on something that someone shared with me, if the team is saying that the student actually didn't miss instruction and the parent knows that the student was logged in to the Teams meeting or Zoom or whatever it was, and the student was not participating, right? So, the district has come back to the parent and said, but he was logged in or she was logged in, I can't remember. And the parent's like, yeah, but not participating, walking away. How do you prove that there is instruction missed? And therefore the regression is there and it's not minimal, that, it's being waived. Like, that's not that big of a deal. It's a summer regression anyway.
So this is common, and I think you're just going to have to rely on the data as far as progress reporting goes. Some parents made a really good effort at documenting when their student wasn't online or would send emails in to the teachers. That should be very helpful. If the student was logged in but not actually participating and the parent never made note of it during that time frame and never contacted the school district staff, it's going to be a difficult issue. And you're just going to have to rely on what the staff recorded as progress. And if, like, I think if the student didn't make progress in one area, it's not going to be a big deal for the district. They're not going to get very excited about it. And they're probably not going to think that the student needs any recovery services. I'm sad to say, but that's what I've seen.
Right. So are they getting, are the teams measuring where the students are after returning to full-time, full-day school in September or in the fall? Are they expected to do that?
They should be, there should be data from June. If the student didn't return full-time by June, then they should be making an effort right now to get progress reporting done. Parents can ask for a progress report on the student's goals, and it shouldn't take 6 weeks, which is what I see.
Thank you, Mary. And then
Yeah.
we have
This is,
Sherilyn.
I've got a question that came to me.
Sure.
This is Janice. Mary, you mentioned that dispute resolution option can be expensive. Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Well, if, for example, you decide that you should proceed with a due process request for an impartial administrative law judge to hear your dispute. Normally, people hire attorneys to do that. Sometimes some parents proceed what is called pro se or by themselves. So I'm going to talk about hiring an attorney. Hiring an attorney is expensive. There's usually a deposit. It's usually an hourly fee. Due process cases can cost $40,000 to $60,000. You usually have to hire an expert witness, which can be $3,000 to $6,000. If you prevail, your attorney can file a request for an award of fees from the school district in another court proceeding to try and recover the attorney fees, so that the attorney fees will be paid for by the school district, so you will not be liable for them. The fees for a expert witness are not recoverable. So that for sure you would be out that if you win, if you prevail. If you file a citizen complaint and you use an attorney, you would be out her or his attorney fees. They are not recoverable. If you file a citizen complaint on your own, that's pretty inexpensive. And now you can do everything electronically if you have a scanner. So it should be pretty cheap. And citizen complaints are supposed to be user-friendly for parents without attorneys. I personally think parents do far better with attorneys at identifying illegal issues and identifying what sorts of evidence is necessary to demonstrate to OSPI that IDEA was violated. But Sound Options is another dispute resolution, which is a mediation that is free. It is paid for by OSPI to resolve disputes you may have with the school district. So that should be free. So I guess the only thing that's really expensive is a due process complaint filed with an attorney. And I can't advise anybody to do that on their own because you will likely lose. So.
This is Janice, and there are two more people who had questions in the chat, Lisa and then Sherilyn. So
Sure.
Lisa, if you want to unmute yourself.
Sure, yeah. I'm one of the people who asked about recovery services and no one being available to provide them. And then you answered my question about whether or not you could go ask for private tutoring or centers to provide that, which you answered. So my follow-up is like, if they've been identified for this and no one is able to provide them, what would you suggest families do to move forward?
So, okay, so that's a really great question. So if you've approached the district and said, hey, you guys agreed to do this and you haven't done it. And I asked you if I could hire a private tutor and you said no, or something like that. Let's just say that's an example. I would file a citizen complaint on that really quickly. That is something OSPI should be interested in. And like I said, I can't see going in front of an ALJ for a due process. I think that is a good little citizen complaint right there. And get it all in writing. That's my tagline. Get everything in writing.
Thank you. So would you suggest that working with good IEP teams that are trying, like have them document it in the prior written notice, that kind of documentation?
Exactly. And if they won't document it in the prior written notice, send them an email and ask them to document that they are refusing to provide the service or that they have been unable to find anyone to provide the service, or however you want to put it, however they put it. You don't want to offend anybody or put words in their mouth. If the issue is they can't find anybody to provide the service, then that's different than saying, they're refusing. And so you want to be careful about what your issue is, and then you would send it in to OSPI. And sometimes what that will do is that will get a lawyer involved on the school district side. It will get them involved, and maybe they can figure out a way to settle the issue with you before OSPI gets to it. But
yeah, this is a school that is all in for and very supportive of providing the services, but there's just no one to provide them, and things have been well documented, and it's just there's no one available.
Right. So you're not complaining about the staff there. You're just complaining about the issue, and just make it clear that that's the issue that needs to be solved.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Sherilyn, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, hi. It's just the quick look.
We lost you, Sherilyn. Are you still there? Maybe she's going to log back in. Yeah. I'm looking for her question and I can read it. So if you give me a second.
I see it.
You want to read it, Yana?
Yeah, with an IEP team about 5 days, probably meeting about 5 days away, and some of the pre-work done, what suggestions do you have if you cannot get a regional, not regional supervisor there? What if you can't get them to come to the meeting?
That's a good question. If you're asking for services that are outside the Seattle public school system, you're going to have a supervisor there, and you should email them that or you should have somebody from Central there. I don't know if maybe it's not a program supervisor. Who do they call those other
Specialist.
specialists? So
Mhm.
somebody from Central should be there. Because I don't think the principal has a budget for it either. So it would be coming from Central. So do we want to wait till she gets back on, or?
Yeah, I don't see her, but we can pass
She
along.
should just write it in an email to be clear. I'm going to be asking for whatever it is. And my understanding is that that needs to be cleared through either a program specialist or a supervisor. So I want to make sure that they are at the meeting. Okay.
Thank you, Mary. And we will definitely, and we are also recording. So
Okay.
great.
This is Janice. Can I ask if there's anyone still on the call who needs the ASL interpreters? If there is, if you could raise your hand or just say yes in the chat, because if not, we will say goodnight to our ASL interpreters.
Looks like we are good.
Looks like we are good. So thank you, Jillian and Mary, for joining us tonight. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
At this point, if anyone else wants to ask a question of Mary, why don't you raise your hand or unmute? Otherwise, I think we're getting close to the end. Any other questions for Mary on the topic of recovery services?
It's Ann here. I don't quite know how to raise my hand, I'm sorry to say, but when I can, I'd like to ask a question.
Go ahead, Ann.
So I suppose there's just not enough time elapsed, but do we have any ALJ kind of baseline or anything about parents, addressing, parents trying to assert recovery, compensation, any of that in the context of the pandemic, or is it still too early?
I haven't
you.
seen it, and I think it goes beyond too early. Like I said, because recovery services are not under federal law, I don't know how an ALJ will address that issue. So I think what I have seen is attorneys filing due process and asking for compensatory services based on services that were missed. In other words, not lack of progress. So if we have a student who has, a lot of them are students who are not able to access remote services. In other words, the IEP team believes that they delivered services over a Zoom or a Teams platform. The student was unable to access because of neurological issues, ADHD, attentional issues, sensory issues, lots of issues. Can't sit in a chair for more than 10-minute issues, mental health issues, all kinds of issues they couldn't access. The school district says, hey, we provided those services. An attorney will say student wasn't able to access those services, therefore there was no delivery of FATE, because delivery requires more than just the school district providing it. The student has to receive it. Student wasn't able to receive it. Platform was inappropriate. So they're going to apply, they're going to ask the judge to award compensatory services. And even those suits are not particularly winnable. So
Thank you.
there's not a lot of good news about that particular issue right now.
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, having gone through a series of IEP processes with a student going into transition, where I think there should be serious emphasis on on these topics. It wasn't raised once, and even when we asked, we were deflected. So I just felt like the Seattle Public Schools was not ready even for a whole crop of students going into transition, could not really wrap their arms around this, and that those students in particular, you know, are at a really critical juncture. Just to say thanks.
Yeah, I totally agree, Anne. I totally agree. And it's not surprising that Seattle Public Schools was not prepared on so many levels. And I mean, and the community overall was not prepared. So it was sort of a double whammy. And so, you know, the legislature did recognize that issue and did issue more money to OSPI that is supposed to trickle out to the districts. If you have a student in transition who has not graduated and did not receive services, the IEP team should consider that and make sure that those services are provided now. So, and I think that's actually like for, you know, time like in a community or job shadowing, that should be basically a one-to-one sort of hour by hour thing if those were missed. It should be more in the realm of compensatory services. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, your whole list, sorry, your whole list of things, from support to take the SATs to
Yeah.
budgeting. I mean, you know, all
I
of
put that in there
those,
just for you, Anne.
the budgeting.
No,
just for me personally. Yeah.
No, I'm totally
No,
joking.
that was a nod to the 2E kids in our lives, right? Yeah. Yeah. I
No.
mean, it's insane. I mean, a lot of these kids need one-on-one support regardless. And
Yeah.
yeah,
So that's
thank you.
all from OSPI. So you can find that online and bring that to your IEP meeting.
Yeah.
So it isn't, Mary Griffin did not make that out.
So Erica, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes, I have the kid with the supposed eyesight problem.
Oh, yes.
And he has since gotten those skills back, so I can't complain.
Oh, okay.
We hired a private physical therapist.
Yay. I don't know if you're going to be able to get any reimbursement for that.
It's better than him crawling on his knees.
Right?
Walk for us.
What? This is a huge problem because if parents have the resources, the ability, they provided those assistances and services, or so many mothers, it just gives me goosebumps. How many mothers sacrificed for their children during the pandemic so that they could
body doubling for him because it helped him with his social emotional health.
Well,
Erica, can you define what you mean by body doubling? There was a question about that in the chat earlier.
It's where I sat with him and encouraged him to attend classes because it helped with his mental health.
Yeah. So you know, you get a gold star from me, but I don't know that you're going to get any reimbursement from the district, but you can try. I would encourage you to try.
I just want some physical therapy for him so he doesn't crawl on his knees. He's 15.
Yeah.
He's 4 years old.
Yeah, poor kid. He was really telling you something with his body there, huh? He was really uncomfortable with seeing all those people on the screen or something. Yeah.
Right.
Wow. Very demonstrative. I had a kid like that. Totally regressed whenever he was stressed out.
So this is Janice, and I'm going to piggyback on something Mary said earlier about encouraging our PTSA to advocate about some of these issues and suggesting things we can do. And I'm just going to say to folks who are here tonight that, you know, to the extent you want to get more involved with us and in our work as a PTSA, supporting families, providing programs like tonight, and advocating to the school board and elsewhere, we would absolutely love to have you. I'm ask some of my fellow board members to, throw our email into the chat, a link to our website into the chat so that, you have that handy. And we have lots of committees some of our committees work on a specific issue. Some of our committees are more generic, like communications and family and community engagement. And it's that committee, that really put together tonight's program and a lot of the other programs we do. And so I just, want to put a pitch out there that, we have a great group of people working really hard, and we can always use more help and would welcome you however much time you can put in. Because the other thing I want to say is that all of us get it. Like we are, almost everyone involved in our PTSA is a parent of one or more kids who have a disability. And so, we all know that there are times we have to step back, and there are other times when we can roll up our sleeves, and help. And so, we really do get it and would love to have you. And for those of you who are still here, I'm just going to quickly tell you about some of our upcoming events. Next week on October 6th, we have a sip and chat that's focused on 2E students. Those are students who are advanced academically and also have a disability. On and that's at 7 o'clock on the 6th. On October 12th at 7 o'clock, we have a program called Soft Landing that is aimed, and if you know families who are new to the district, either they've just moved or they can be any age. Maybe they've just learned that their child has a disability and they're getting an IEP, or they're entering the system through preschool or kindergarten. Our Soft Landing program is kind of an introduction of our PTSA, sort of some, top tips, 10 top tips, discussions of, like how to approach the journey, because it's a long journey. And so if you know families who might be interested in that, please spread the word. We're going to have a 2-part series that we haven't publicized much yet. The first session will be October 14th, and the second section, November 3rd. These are going to be lunchtime seminars from noon to 1 on school avoidance and school refusal. We know this has been a big issue for a lot of our kids this year in particular. And we have Dr. Kendra Reed, who's a professor at UW, and she's at Seattle Children's, and she specializes in anxiety, and she runs, Seattle Children's has a support group for families who have children going through school avoidance and school refusal, which she runs. And I think we will also have some folks from OSPI there who will be able to answer questions about sort of the attendance implications. Questions like, they're not going to present, but they'll be there to help answer questions after Dr. Reed's presentation. So the first session on the 14th is mostly going to be a presentation, and November 3rd is going to be a Q&A session with Dr. Reed. We have a monthly general meeting in October, on October 19th. The month of October is Disability History Month. And there's a Washington state law that requires schools to provide educational experiences during the month of October about disability history and disability awareness. And so we're working on our agenda for that monthly meeting on October 19th, but it's probably going to focus on some resources that families can bring to their schools around providing education around disability history and awareness. And then the last one two more I'm going to tell you about. On October 26th, we are hosting a community conversation about inclusion. And if you don't already know this, our state, the state of Washington, ranks 44th in the country for including students with disabilities in general education settings. And that's pretty bad. And there is a statewide effort now to improve that. And Seattle's data is worse than the statewide data. And so there is a lot of work to be done in Seattle to promote and bring about more inclusionary practices in our schools. And we are hosting the community conversation about inclusion as an effort to bring in stakeholders in our schools, not just parents and teachers, but community organizations, legislators, groups employers, people who care and have an interest and a stake in making sure that all of our students receive the education they're entitled to so that they can rise to their greatest potential and join the community once they're done with school. So we are going to be hosting that community conversation in an effort to sort of develop some common language about the benefits of inclusion, and then use that as a way of showing our school district the critical importance to elevate this as a value and make it something that our district takes on in a much more coordinated and strategic way. So it's a really, really important event. And it's especially important to bring parents and folks to the event who don't have kids with disabilities, because this is not just about the disability community, it's about everybody. And so to the extent you can help us by promoting it in your schools, in your PTAs, among your network of friends, and encourage people to join us on October 26th, we would really, really appreciate it. And then we also have a webinar coming on November 3rd, November 2nd on assistive technology. And last but not least, we don't have a date for this yet, but I will just share that we are working on putting together a workshop on how to write a citizen complaint and how to draft it and what to expect during the citizen complaint process with OSPI. So that's some of what we've had coming down the road. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and for those of you who are still here for sticking it out through my pitch. And I should actually stop the recording. I forgot to do that. So I'm going to do that now.
We should also thank Mary for putting this together and presenting